In this video, let's start talking about TTP's groups, and we're going to dive into a lot more of the order of processing of TTP groups and the idea of the group to start processing and the ideas of rows in a group. And this gets somewhat complicated, so let's just dive in with some simple examples so we can try to see the pattern that's going on here. So if we look at this one section that I have here, so I have this one TTP template, and it's just parsing a set of global parameters. So hostname, NTP server, which I've actually moved into the global group, and the clock time zone. Now let's go ahead and just execute this, and I'm going to show you that this runs properly and it extracts those three variables. Now notice the structure. So we have these two embedded lists, and then ultimately we get to this dictionary that has our global key matching our group name, and then inside there we have three variables. Now the first point that I want to illustrate is that the host name, the very first line in the group, basically causes the group to start operating, to start executing, and that the other lines in the group don't actually activate until the first line is hit. So I'm going to show you an example of this. So here we have hostname, and if you notice in our Arista1 config, of those three lines, hostname actually comes first. So TTP, until it hits this hostname line, will not process the other lines. You can think of it as the basically the group start. The first line is what kicks off and starts the group for execution. So if we change the order of this, of our template, and we actually moved the clock time zone to be first, let's look at the behavior and see what happens. So when we move the clock time zone to be first in our template, once again, here's our template. When we move that to be first, then these rest of these lines don't start processing until we hit this line. And since this line, the clock time zone, is the last of the three lines, it will never see them. Like, those lines have already went past, so we haven't hit the first line in our group when we're here. We haven't hit the first line in our group when we get here. We finally get here, and this matches the first line in our group, and that kicks off, that starts the group processing. But then after that, we have no additional hostname, we have no additional NTP server. So we only get that one variable. So the key idea here is the first line in the template kicks off, it fires off the processing, it starts it. And there's ways we can modify this start behavior. There's a couple ways we'll go into, but the key point is the first line in the group template by default is going to kick off the processing. It's going to start the processing for that section, and unless you hit that, the other lines in it will not be processed. Okay, now let's return it to its correct point. Now the second point is, after the first line, the order doesn't matter. So with this format, and there's some nuance in this, but with this format, since the host name is first, once we hit the first name, it's going to process all the other lines, and the order will not matter for the other lines. So once we get here, we hit the first one, that tells us to start processing the other lines. And then, in our config, NTP server is actually, the second one we hit, and clock time zone is the third one we hit. But in our template, we've reversed those. So the clock we put first, the NTP server second. And so once we hit this one, it basically is going to process all the other lines, and the order won't matter. So if that is correct, when we do this, we're going to see the three entries in the output. And let's look at that and see what we get. So we do get all three entries. We get the host name, we get the NTP server, we get the time zone. So the second key point there. So the first key point is the very first line kicks off the group processing. It gets it started. The second point is all the other lines after the first line, the order doesn't matter. They're treated as equally, and they will just process them as they see them, because you've started the processing for the group, and then it's just looking for other lines that match properly. Now, the third point that I want to show you here with respect to this group processing in order is this idea that you can have multiple rows. So now in this set of data, we only have one of each of hostname, clock, NTP server. So let me get them back to the order that matches the config. Now, what if we had, and this is obviously isn't a real life config, but what if we had multiple start lines in our config? So I'll put a second start line down near the clock entry. So, and we're going to see examples where we have multiple entries. Now, if you notice this output data structure here, it's just a single dictionary with keys values. But what if we run into multiple occurrences of our start line? What happens? What changes to the output data structure that we get? And let's look at that. So now you see that we don't get a single dictionary. We get a list of dictionaries. So you can think of these as rows, where the first start line, the host name in this case, every time we run into that line, we're going to kick off a new row in our output data. So we encountered the host name the first time, and then it processes all the other lines below it. Then it found an ETP server, so that it adds that. We run into the second host name. It's going to create a new row. A new row is created, and then we found the time zone after that, and it stuffs that in there. So every time that start line is ran into, we create a new row in our output data. And there's a way in NTP that if we wanted to have even a single row, like we're back here, to be a list of dictionaries and not a single dictionary, we could do that, because sometimes that's easier in your post-processing code. Like, for example, if you have static routes and there might be a single static route and there might be multiple static routes, you might always want that returned data structure to be a list of dictionaries, so that it's easier for you to post-process in Python. There's a way we can do that in TTP.